Thanks everyone for being here. This is an amazing panel. It's an honor to have this discussion, especially right now in the middle of harvest. I can't believe I actually corralled all of you to show up at the same time, but here we are. So thanks so much. But to kick this off, I wanted to actually hand this over to Joe Fish, CEO of Wine Access.
Great, thanks Vanessa. Hi all, and thanks for joining us for what I think is going to be an absolute amazing panel. As Vanessa said, my name is Joe Fish, CEO of Wine Access, where we really see ourselves as the best place to discover and enjoy the world's most inspiring wines. Have an absolutely amazing lineup. So when I kind of look around, well, I should say the proverbial room, absolutely amazing, producers and winemakers here to have a very fun discussion. And every time we do these things, I'm always happy that we have Vanessa Conlin to go ahead and host. For most of you out there, she doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway, because every time I get to introduce her, it's another reason to brag about one of my colleagues and also very good friends. So Vanessa is the 52nd Master of Wine in the US, and that's one of 408 in the world. So to kind of put that into perspective, there are about 50 more active NBA players than there are MWs in the world. So when I think of her, I think of her as the Steph Curry of the wine world. She's been in the wine business for over 15 years, serving as the Director of Sales and Marketing for some of Napa's most prestigious estates, including Arietta, Donna Estates, and Realm Cellars. Before that, she was a wine buyer for two prominent Manhattan wine retailers and the wine director at a Manhattan-based wine bar. She's a frequent speaker at industry events, such as this one, and has given lectures at Harlan Estate, the Napa Valley Reserve, and for the Plump Jack Group. She's a certified WSET instructor and teaches frequently at the Napa Valley Wine Academy. So with that, I will pass it back over to Vanessa.
So I'm going to introduce everyone, but first, why are we here? Well, first of all, I need to thank our friends over at Edgehill and Rudd for bubbling this idea up originally. So what's Ribolla Gialla? It's a white wine variety that is exceptionally rare outside of the eastern edges of Friuli and in Slovenia. And if you've never heard of it, don't worry, you're not alone. It's hard to find even in its native Italy. However, the variety has been prized for quality since at least the late 13th century. It has several champions in Friuli, one of whom, Josko Grabner, introduced it to a grower in Napa several decades ago, inspiring him to plant a small parcel. It has since grown a small cult following among the best and brightest of Napa winemaking. And today, it's our privilege to talk to some of these winemakers and to learn more about this hidden gem. So on the panel today, in no particular order, Steve Matthiasson, viticulturalist and winemaker of Matthiasson Wines. Dan Petroski, winemaker proprietor, Massican Winery. Frederick Ammons, winemaker, Edgehill and Rudd. We have Megan Glaab, winemaker of Ryme. Duncan Arnot Roberts, winemaker, Arnot Roberts. And Miguel Luna, co-winemaker of Grassi Wine Company and partner in Silverado Farming Company. So this is really quite a powerhouse lineup. To kick this off, Dan, if you don't mind, I'm catching you mid-sip of coffee, but I'd love to start with you. Most consumers have never heard of Ribolla Gialla. Why is it so under the radar, and why does it matter?
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks to the Wine Access team for having us here today. I'm super honored to be with my friends. I wish I was with them all in person having this conversation. But Ribolla Gialla, just like the 360 other grape varieties from Italy, are pretty under the radar. Italy is one of the most diverse wine growing regions in the world, with a number of grape varieties, and it tends to be very regionalized. So Ribolla comes, as you mentioned, Vanessa, from Italy's northeast, and not a lot of those grape varieties are going to travel very far from that region. Just like some of the best Ribolla Gialla winemakers in Friuli haven't traveled very far. Some of them have never been on an airplane, if you go up there and meet them. So when you think about, the vastness of the amount of varieties that have made its way over to America or to South America, Southern Hemisphere, it's not a lot of different grape varieties that have kind of globalized. And to have that, as you mentioned, George Vare and the relationship he's had with this grape variety during his lifetime was truly special. And Steve has probably the longest relationship with George, having farmed his vineyard for him and traveled with him to the northeast of Italy to kind of explore Ribolla a little farther and a little deeper. But it's a unique grape variety because it's kind of slightly diversified. It can be made into sparkling wine, it can be made into fresh wine, it can be also made into macerated wines. And we have people, on this panel have done all three. So it'll be really fun to kind of explore that a little bit and talk a little bit about that.
Dan, you mentioned George Vare, and so that was one of the questions I wanted to explore or introduce to our audience. But maybe Steve, you can take this. Can you tell us a little bit about him and the impact he had on Napa Valley?
Yeah, well, I mean, George had an impact way before Ribolla as well, because George was one of the sort of titans of the industry. I mean, when he was working for Schlitz Brewing, when they bought Geyser Peak in the early 70s, and all the brewery managers said, who wants to go run a winery? In the early 70s, that was pretty rinky-dink. And George was like, I'll go run a winery in Sonoma. And so he ended up, I think it was 1972, running Geyser Peak. Then he started Gloria Ferrer. He did a ton of stuff. He ran Behringer for a long time. And he was one of those really rare people in that level in the wine industry who truly had a love for wine, which I hate to say, but people can get cynical when they get into those high-level widget management finance positions. And George just loved wine. And so he had started going to Italy to renew his sort of passion and love for wine and get with he developed all these long-term relationships with the farmers there. And the reason he gravitated to Ribolla and to Friuli was that that's probably the most sort of maverick-oriented wine growing region and grape variety that you're going to find. I mean, it's impossible to put your finger to say, here's how Ribolla Gialla is made in Friuli. It's made whole, barrel fermented like Miani, or buried in amphora like Grosvenor, or buried in the ground like Movia and dug up at the full moon, or like reductive Chablis style like E. Clevy, or like long whole cluster, high oxidative like Radicon. I mean, it's just all over the whole board. And it really represents like freedom and individuality and personal just passion for your own vision. And George just loved that. And so he said for his retirement, he decided, you know what, I'm done with the wine business at the big finance level. I'm going to go ahead and for my retirement project, I'm going to make something that just totally represents that passion for wine and for just doing things yourself, your own way. And that was Ribolla, basically. So it was just, he was such a departure, and it was so George, because he was always, outside thinking. And there was no coincidence in terms of who then he decided to sell fruit to, because he loved people that were young people doing different things. And so like, I remember he would collect clippings and send it in. And if Arnot Roberts got something in the press, which was not as common back like 15 years ago, and say, look at this, I need to call them up and tell them, that's so great that they're getting recognition for doing something different. And so that was what Ribolla was for George.
Miguel, I have a question for you. I believe you work with that same vineyard, but you also planted an acre at Grassi. So I'm curious, as a variety in the vineyard, what's its personality? What does it behave like?
It's bipolar, I would say. It's very, very tricky to grow. We have an acre, and there's a row that completely crashes at the beginning of September right now, and 2 rows later, the tips are still green. So it's definitely very, very finicky depending on the soil. It struggles a lot with rocky areas. There's a time when there's not enough water you could put in to keep those vines going, and they kind of just call it a season and drop the leaves. So far it's been a challenge. Learning. Always picking Steve's brain. He's the master. He's been on it for longer than any one of us. So it's very tricky to grow. I must say. It's been fun and challenging at the same time. Our vineyard is only 5 years old. We planted in 2016. So last year was the first year we actually harvested fruit to make wine, and that's the one that's going to be a sparkling wine that we're making. But 2018, we made some in the garage just for fun. And I think I took it to Steve's party last year, which I missed this year. This year, we're taking it a little more serious starting last year. It's riddling right now. So we should be disgorging soon.
I actually wanted to ask, I've never had a traditional method sparkling Ribolla Gialla. I mean, how does it take to autolysis?
So far, it's been pretty easy. I mean, the first year we did kind of like a fake pet nat, I call it, where we froze some of the must before the fermentation, and then at the end of fermentation, because it was garage winemaking, I knew I wasn't going to have time to be taking care of it in the middle of harvest. So we just added that at the end of the fermentation, like in December, and bottled. So it was pretty straightforward. So far, it's been great. We're really happy. Actually opened a bottle on Friday, and very clean, very aromatic, and excited. We're gonna do a very short. We're gonna keep it very short on the yeast and clean it up and keep the freshness on the wine. That's the goal for this wine.
Can't wait to try it. Duncan, a question for you. So for anyone, you know, watching at home, streaming this, who's never had Ribolla, like, what would you compare it to? Or are there any other varieties that you feel like it's most similar to?
This may sound a little strange, but often it reminds me more of like a really perfect gin and tonic than it does a white wine that I can reference.
Well, now you're talking Dan's language.
I know. That was a soft pitch to Dan, but there's a natural bitterness, at least in our experience, which is limited. We started working with the Vare vineyard in 2009, but there's a bit of a hallmark, at least in this vineyard site and this expression, that has a natural bitterness. And I think it's a word that some winemakers are afraid to utter because it has a connotation for some people that maybe steers it in a direction away from enjoyment and into austerity. I don't know, but I like it. It's almost like walnut. It's almost like birch bark, you know, quinine. There's a little bit of this little zip to it. And it's something other than just acid and fruit. It's different than just minerality that you get from a really transparent Chardonnay grown in, you know, limestone. It's something different. And I love that nature of it. It really, and that seems to accentuate over time in the bottle. Something that I know George was a big proponent of, and Nathan and I are too, is we're trying to age as much as we can. It's seeming to age quite well. Our 2009 is still fresh and lively, but that nice bitterness, that nice birchy quality that I call, has seemed to pop even into further clarity with some age in bottle. So I think it's unique in that regard. It's a good tonic.
I like it. And Frederick, a question for you. I know that you have a lot of different fermentation and maturation vessels at Rudd and Edgehill. So what do you think is best for Ribolla?
I think it's hard to say. Again, I'm also in the camp of having limited experience, only a couple of vintages working with the fruit we grow ourselves. And I agree with that. That bitterness is very interesting about this grape variety, and something that I think is really important to take into consideration, because I was looking, we have decent acid, but it's not a grape variety that strikes me as being very acidic for a white variety. And instead you have a freshness, I think, that comes from that touch of bitterness that also makes it very work well, not only for aging, but for going with food as well, which I think is really interesting to have that little bit of phenolic character for the palate during a meal. But when it comes to the fermentation, we've experimented with a number of different things. Rudd has a history of using concrete fermenters for whites going quite a ways back. I felt that it wasn't really as well suited for the concrete, and most recently we've been working with the terracotta, a kind of a nod to, I think, to a lot of other Ribollas that have been made historically. But I really am happy with the way that the terracotta performed, and we did just a very limited skin maceration in that as well too. It's a little bit more inert than I would have expected, and so to have something that maybe breathes and is a little bit more organic, I like large format neutral wood as well too. I really like a nice punch in or something like that. So
great. And then Megan, I'd love to bring you into the conversation too. So do you think that part of the appeal of Ribolla is that few people or consumers have heard of it? So does it kind of automatically put the consumer in a select club if they're in the know?
Good question. I mean, the appeal for me specifically is just the love for the variety. And I think any of us, if you're passionate about it, that passion carries on and hopefully continues to educate new consumers of varieties that are out there that aren't widely heard of or known. And, you know, for us, it's exciting. It's exciting to play with a different variety that we think has amazing potential in California. And I think the panel here and the winemakers here that are working with it would agree that Ribolla does beautifully and makes gorgeous wines here. It's just a matter of educating consumers and getting them to know this variety.
Well, that sort of leads very organically to a question that I actually wanted to ask Steve. I have that you are quoted as saying Ribolla represents, and you talked a little bit about this just earlier, represents passion, exploration, and vision, as well as tradition and timelessness. So that's really, really high praise from a winemaker. But do you think that that kind of passion can translate to the consumer?
I think so. I mean, if you're a person that truly loves wine, that's what you're you're consuming the passion, right? I mean, we don't want focus group, recipe wine. You're looking, what's exciting is wine that has passion behind it and has a vision. And the cool thing about Ribolla is that that's there, but yet it's an ancient variety. And so there is a timelessness to it. And, you get all of, with Ribolla, it's all of that 1,000 years, probably plus of history in there, that you have humans shepherding this along because it's so great, mixed with the made today with a ton of passion. Because like Ribolla, is not, no one just says path of least resistance, I'm going to make Ribolla Gialla, right? You by definition, anyone who's making Ribolla Gialla is passionate about it. And so that's the beauty of it, but they're not making it up out of thin air. They're interpreting something that's ancient. It's this really cool tension. That's what makes Ribolla so great.
From the consumer to the somm, and Dan, this is a question for you. Why do you think it's such a somm favorite?
It came out at the right place and the right time in California. It started out as a really impressive sommelier favorite at the French Laundry when George Vare was making 500 ml bottles and Bobby Stuckey was pouring it by the glass at the French Laundry. And we all know where Bobby and Stuckey went on to open up, one of the country's greatest Italian restaurants in Frasca in Boulder, Colorado. So it really kind of started from that wave, but a very small kind of ripple. And then it wasn't until, as Steve said, when George had his retirement and then opened up his vineyard to a number of winemakers, and everyone here on this panel, Megan and Duncan, and we were just all like so excited about getting in there. It was also at the time when the quote unquote New California movement was happening. And the New California movement was about the idea of exploration and, kind of looking backward to kind of take 2 steps forward. And Ribolla Gialla just fit in the right time in the right place. And it had all those things that Duncan and Frederick were talking about texturally and bitterness and being on the table as a food-friendly wine. And also was at that moment in time when, the macerated wine style was kind of, in the mid-aughts all the way through, the present day, was becoming popular in restaurants. And then Megan and Ryan at Ryme, took advantage of that style, and they just kind of blew it up and just made an incredibly delicious wine for the table. So I think it was the right time, the right place. And at the same time, it's just the right funkiness and weirdness of a grape variety that doesn't fit into a mold, that everyone was kind of looking for their own personal exploration, as Steve was describing earlier.
Steve, a question for you. We talked a little bit about how many different ways it can be sort of handled in the winery, but what about it makes it suitable for skin contact?
That little bitterness and that little phenolic that people have been talking about, it just I think is kind of a preservative. It's a natural preservative in Ribolla. This little phenolic that can eat up oxygen and can sort of protect the wine. For skin contact wines, white wines to work well, in my experience, they do need oxygen. So because the skin contact wines can be a little astringent, a little too tannic, and they can't polymerize the way that red wines can, soften and build this mid palate with the anthocyanins, which is the color. You don't have that in the white wine, and so I think white wine takes more oxygen in order for it to soften. But then, so some white varieties with a skin contact version of that can sort of fall apart on you before the flavors can get overly oxidized before the tannin structure is kind of soft enough. Ribolla Gialla has this really cool way of preserving itself. I think it's the phenolics that kind of bitterness, but regardless, it just sort of holds together better than really any other white wine I know at when it's with oxygen, and then can go the distance basically while still keeping its freshness.
Miguel, a question for you from someone watching at home. They want just clarification on your traditional method sparkling wine. Is it 100% Ribolla Gialla?
Yes, 100%.
Got it.
And it will be a blend of 2 vineyards. We're still figuring it out. So it's a blend of the Vare vineyard or Vineyard and the Grassi vineyard.
Maybe we can stick with you for a minute. So Napa obviously is, you know, different climate than Friuli. So how does it change the profile or the characteristics of the wine growing here versus, let's say, in Northeast Italy?
There's like a general idea that Ribolla is this like high acidic sippy wine, and I that's not what it is. You know, it's really tricky making those picking decisions because you lose the acid in 2-3 days. So always looking at your pH and your acid is almost more important than looking at the sugar levels. So that's one of the things. You know, beginning of September, the berries turn really golden. So that's where the Gialla comes in. For Grassi, I know when Robbie was making the wines, he was always had the same joke to Steve that it was supposed to be Ribolla Gialla, not Ribolla Verde. And because Robbie was always the last one to pick. So Ribolla, I think that's one of the main things, that it's not a highly acidic wine. It's much more complex and very, very viscous. The phenolic touch of it and sometimes a slight sweetness at the beginning comes with the California weather. That's the main differences I've seen when you compare it to the Italian wines.
So I have another question from home of Duncan, and if you want to take this, it's about rootstocks. Actually, we have a very technical crowd apparently. Are there certain rootstocks that work better for Ribolla Gialla?
I would say it's probably site specific, but that's certainly a question that I will just diplomatically flick to Steve because he has a longer track record in the vineyard. You know, I tend to think that site really plays a huge role in the final outcome of the grape variety. But of course, if you match it perfectly with the right rootstock, I don't know that was done in the first place. There's a lot of experimentation that's happened here. So maybe Steve can answer that technical question better.
Because it has the problem Miguel was saying earlier, that it has this razor's edge, that if you give it a little bit too much water or clay in the soil, it's overly vigorous. If it's too dry, too rocky, it crashes on you. So it's the exact same rootstock needs as any other variety, but you have less room for error basically with Ribolla, you know, because with the normal variety, you're trying to match the rootstock to the site so that it grows enough, but not too much, and has enough water stress for high quality and for the vines to struggle throughout the season, but it also has enough access to water to make it all the way to the end. So that's what you think that with any vineyard, but with Ribolla, you just don't have any room for error, basically.
Got it. So Steve, I'm going to stick with you and maybe put you on the spot just a little, but you know, obviously we're here in Napa Valley where Cabernet Sauvignon can command quite a premium price. And if I'm correct, I read you have 7 rows of Ribolla Gialla planted.
Yeah.
How can that possibly be financially viable?
Yeah. Well, you know, you don't. I met when the very first wine we made for Matthiasson, when we started our own in 2003. I was trading consulting with Custom Crush with Art Finkelstein, who unfortunately passed away some years ago. And Art said to me, he said, some people can make, he goes, you're getting started in the wine business. You're going to look around and you see people that made money in the wine industry. I've never figured out how that happened. He goes, so my advice to you is don't worry about making money, enjoy it, because it's a great life. And that's been our motto ever since. And so, yeah, as long as we can like hang in there and do it again next year, we succeeded.
Well, as long as it's just fulfilling and you're loving what you're doing, right?
Exactly. And it's not, and it's true. It's not a cliche. I mean, it's awesome. So I'd much rather make Ribolla Gialla than make a little bit more money.
Yeah.
Megan, a question for you. So I know that for your hers and his Vermentino, you have one that's destemmed and one that isn't. Have you tried that same experiment with Ribolla Gialla?
No, we haven't. I mean, Ryan and I really agreed that we love Ribolla Gialla on skins. Like we do enjoy all versions, but really our The reason why Ryan wanted to do his Vermentino was as a direct comparison with Ribolla Gialla. So to see two white varieties that are structurally very different side by side. So Ribolla has a lot more phenolic structure, where Vermentino has almost none at all. And, you know, for us, we really love, you know, getting to the point of it being Gialla. So we tend to pick, we're in that last round at Vare, and then fermenting on skins and extracting as much phenolics. And we leave ours on skins for 6 months and age it for 2 years before we even bottle it. And we really love it. Until we disagreed on that version, we wouldn't make a hers. You know, we've been lucky that we actually see eye to eye on almost everything, except for the Vermentino.
Very lucky. Well, if we could stick with you just for a minute, Megan. So what's Ribolla Fest, and does it still happen?
Oh, Steve, is it still happening?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is it. We're doing it right now as we speak. Next year we'll be back in person.
Honestly, Ribolla Fest to me is my favorite event of the year, hands down. The reason why is that it's just, you know, this group of people who are not only friends, but peers that I really admire and respect. We have so much fun. We come together. Steve always cooks some whole animal, and then we share what we've done the previous harvest. And to have that collaborative, very open discussion is just, it's unique, and I think it really just talks about, you know, it shows this community and how lucky we are to be a part of it.
One of my questions I wanted to ask was, how much do you sort of talk amongst yourselves and compare notes? So it sounds like.
Well, I mean, we get up, you know, everybody gets up and speaks in front of the crowd, which I don't know, Steve, how many people? It's like 40 to 50 people.
Yeah, 40 to 50, and it's, you know, it's probably 2/3 people in the trade, maybe 1/3 of them are winemakers, and 1/3 are sommeliers, and 1/3 are consumers that we love. Like I noticed Tom Hill, I saw him chat and say hi from Los Alamos, so he's been at Ribolla Fest a few times. But you know, it's the one time a year where we can be unapologetically geeky.
And I mean, it started in 2008 too, with us just having the luncheon with George, and kind of evolved from there to Steve and Jill's property. And it truly is a special event.
Hopefully I'll get invited one of these days.
Oh yes.
You got lost until now, but you know. No excuses. I work from home. Like I check the mail today now. So anyway, Frederick, I had a question about your mixed whites. So I was trying to remember from a visit I had a while ago, but is that that's a field blend? Is that?
No, it's not a field blend. We purchased a little bit of the fruit from an outside vineyard, and it's never really been like a fixed sort of blend. It's been a sort of a theme each year. But the foundation, the basis for the wine, which, you know, talk about, you know, the idea of sort of doing something that's a little bit, as Steve said, a little bit maverick, or more a passion project for Leslie Rudd. He had decided to do this before I was part of the Rudd team, which was to convert over some prime Cabernet land to Ribolla to, again, be sort of somewhat maverick, but also to try and explore what could be done with the grape variety. I think he had caught the bug a little bit visiting in Italy as well. And so the goal for me always with the mixed whites has been sort of to base it around the Ribolla Gialla. We also have a little Greco di Tufo planted up there as well too. And then add to that to sort of put another layer onto it to sort of to tell a story. I think in the glass, it sort of transcends each of the individual grape varieties, have all those different pieces work together well. But when you say field blend, I guess you could say that because we have so little Greco di Tufo that it usually ends up co-fermenting with the Ribolla. You got to time that just right.
Dan, I have a question for you. So do you think that there's an appeal with sort of younger consumers? You know, well, everyone's always thinking like, how do I appeal to millennials? Do you think the fact that it's not like your father's like Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay makes it more appealing to a younger generation?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we've come out of the the anything but Chardonnay ABC category of consumers many many years ago. I think we've all established that Chardonnay is still one of the greatest grapes grown on the planet. But I think style has kind of pushed people in different directions, and it's always going to be a rebellion against your parents. And I heard that when I was selling advertising at Time magazine, when I was a 20-something-year-old selling advertising to 20-something-year-olds for this old person's magazine. That's how it was described by my clients. And but it was, I think we're all looking at it from the wine world starting about 10 years ago really had this kind of renaissance that really followed the table. It followed the restaurant culture, and as restaurants diversified, wine service diversified, and so it brought us along with it. It was a nice tailwind that kind of brought us in. And as restaurants went farther away from fine dining and closer to casual, closer to price points where as Steve just touched on it about this being a lifestyle and being something that is a passion. I think we're starting to see people kind of explore and get more bang for their buck and spend their money in 3 restaurants and drinking 3 different types of wines as opposed to going for one fine dining restaurant that our parents would have sat down and went out to once a month or once every 3 months. So I do think that there's a generational shift, of course, in what we're doing, but it's just not just Ribolla Gialla. It's in brands like Matthiasson and Arnot Roberts and Ryme, and that's where I think culturally we're seeing the next generation gravitate towards.
I remember when I was learning about wine and all I knew about decanting was for red wines. And I remember someone blew my mind once by decanting a white wine at a restaurant. I thought, why on earth would you do that? So could you explain maybe for someone at home who's never thought about decanting a white wine, why you would do that? And do you recommend it for your wine, for Ribolla Gialla?
I'm definitely a fan of decanting white wine, wine in general. I think there's certain varieties that maybe don't need it, but Ribolla certainly opens up substantially with some time in the decanter. And I like to do it with other white wines as well. Aged whites, a little bit of time in the decanter brings them together. Sometimes you'll get your first smell of a glass of older white wine. Maybe it's not jumping out at you. It's not giving you that immediate gratification, and which is fine. It unfolds a little bit with time in decanter. And I think Ribolla, for the things we talked about, it's complex. There's a lot going on. And I think we make our wine in a I wouldn't call it a reductive style, but we're pretty careful about our introduction of oxygen in the winemaking process. And it's part of the reason why is because we want the wine to be able to age in bottle for a long time and slowly come into its own once it reaches maturity, and then comes into its own in the glass. So in the decanter, absolutely. So for a young Ribolla like the 2018, which is what I'm drinking right now, it's not all that often that I sit down and just drink our own wine. There's so many amazing things to taste, and to come back to it a couple years later, I'm really happy with the 18. I probably should have decanted it. I have a pretty good sized glass, and the wine keeps changing moment by moment. I noticed that I'm the only one drinking here, and it is 4:30, 20 to 5 here. Okay, Megan, good job. Thank you. Okay, you guys too. Okay, thank you. Steve, come on. Do you have a Bota bag around your neck or something? Anyway, yeah, I think that Ribolla is well suited for decanting. And it should come up to temperature a little bit. And we've played around a little bit with macerated Ribolla. We've done some amphora as well, and I do think that you do a disservice to that wine if it's served too cold. I don't know that you want it at room temp, but just a slight chill on it is great. I think the wine really unfolds better. I'm drinking the wine that I have in my glass right now from cellar temp at about 55. It could probably be a couple degrees colder, but I don't think certainly doesn't need to be refrigerator temp. And a little time in a big glass or a decanter, absolutely.
Yeah, Duncan, along those lines, something else I've noticed, and it kind of goes along with what Steve was saying with the air, is that I find this with red wines as well too, is that sometimes it's really interesting to see how these wines change like overnight. So open a bottle and then come back to it the next day or even the third day. And I've been really amazed with the Ribolla. I think it's probably that phenolic character again, how interesting the wine can be even in the next day or even on a third day.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and with ours, we really look at it like, treating it like a red wine, to decant it in several hours before enjoying, and for it to be cellar temp or warmer. And, you know, it definitely opens up, becomes more aromatic, and then also savory as well with time.
Question, maybe Steve, you want to take this as question from someone at home is how does skin contact Ribolla Gialla compare to the orange wines of Georgia? I'm very, very knowledgeable crowd watching.
Okay, well, you know, and Grosvenor wanted to go back to the old skin contact style 20 some years ago. He went to Georgia to get the amphora to bring back to Friuli, because they were no longer making them in Friuli. They had originally made, you know, they had lost that tradition in Friuli. So you know, the idea was that Georgia was continuing what used to be done in all over that part of the world. And so I would say, so the Georgia wines are probably, I mean, one of the fun things about Georgia wines to me is like it's kind of a time capsule to look into some, you know, to some more ancient methods of winemaking and some of the varieties as well. So I think there's a lot of comparisons, basically.
I don't know if this is a loaded question given the fact that you're all producers of Ribolla Gialla, but do you think that obviously you're all very well regarded, respected, you know, winemakers, it's sort of having its moment, I feel like now. Do you feel like, let's say, next generation of winemakers coming up behind you, are they going to be as interested, or do you think this is like its moment, at least for the American consumer?
One of the things I think is so great about what's happening right now in the wine world is that winemakers, it sounds obvious, but young winemakers are making wines that they believe in and want to drink, which was not the case when I got started in the business. People thought you had to make the wine at the critic's palate, or you wouldn't have a successful business. And so now people are making wines that they're excited about. And so I don't know that Ribolla is having its moment. I think that Ribolla is just, this ancient variety has been resurrected a bit, I guess, or brought here. And so I don't think it's going away, but I also think that it's helped to break open some barriers so that a whole lot more varieties are going to come. And I don't think that leaves Ribolla behind. I think it just gives Ribolla more credence, because we're getting away from the idea that there's only 5 or 6 varieties that are quote unquote noble, and get back to finding lots of great things in a lot of varieties.
I think another thing along those lines, Steve, that I think Ribolla has going for it is that there is such a diversity of wines that are made from it. It doesn't have as narrow focused genre, or it's not as pigeonholed as Sauvignon Blanc can be, or some of the other grape varieties. So that leaves a lot of freedom, I think, for people to do really neat things with it. So I think that's part of its charm as well, too, that will be there for a long time.
I think that Ribolla Fest has helped a lot with young people going and tasting those wines. And, you know, like you go there and it's like a hipster party. So it's great. And I know like people who make Albarino have taken that idea, and now there's an Albarino Fest in Napa. So I think not only Ribolla is shining, I think people are just bringing more white wines and playing with them around.
This comes from John Bonet, who wrote for a long time for the San Francisco Chronicle, and obviously was a real voice of support for our region and for the New California in general. Obviously his book, very influential. I think he pointed out a changing of the guard of the palates out there a little bit, going from the Coca-Cola generation, and I'm paraphrasing, but going from the Coca-Cola generation to the Sour Patch Kid generation or something like that, where it went something like kids that were raised on Coke, they liked bigger, sweeter wines, and then Sour Patch Kids came out and people started eating those, and they're like, whoa, acid, like this is something exciting, and this is actually like, this is way more exciting than just sugar. And I kind of have this, I like to think this, I think positive about this, that there's like a group of people that are coming into their understanding of flavor, that appreciate acidity. They appreciate lighter roast coffee. They appreciate green olive oil. They appreciate a good gin and tonic. They appreciate things that have leanness and have tension and have energy and have an acid, have a balance to it, and not just acidity, because we talked about this before with Ribolla not necessarily being a high acid variety, but the bitterness. And there's something about it that's just so engaging, and it's so unique to the variety, that I think that it inherently, Ribolla Gialla, has the potential to convert people for years to come once they try it. They just need to open their minds and taste, open their eyes and taste, open their palates, and once they taste it, and it's something completely new that goes totally against what they maybe were raised on, that it's really engaging. And of course, because it's so good with food, it's a natural to just segue from that interest and that sort of enthusiasm for something new, which can be a way to sell wine. But once people go past that just being new, and they realize that it works really well in their lifestyle with food, and is really it's a wine that can go, you can serve it cold, you can serve it a little warmer, you can serve it with all different kinds of food. It cuts through all kinds of stuff. It's a really versatile wine. So I don't know, I feel like the Sour Patch generation is there for us now a bit. And I'll leave that back to John Bonnet. I wish he was here on the conversation, because he would illuminate that much more clearly than I did, but there's something to it, I think.
I think you nailed it, Duncan. I was just at Vanessa. I was having a conversation with one of your colleagues in the Master of Wine program, Carolyn Gilby, this morning, and I said, the natural wine movement really is kind of, people are familiar with things like kombucha and fermented product, and the last 10 years has been about fermented product and how books about fermentation and fermenting at home and pickling, and so we're all kind of like opening up and tasting and trying new things. I think that's been a really, if you drank a kombucha, then you go to the Four Horsemen in Brooklyn and sit down at that restaurant and try some really kind of something that might be a little off aroma, off flavor to a classic wine drinker. Now you're like, oh shit, I mean, I've had farty kombucha. This is what wine could be, or this is what wine should be. Oh, this must be naturally healthy, and it's gonna help my gut, my digestion.
So Dan, actually, a question that came in for you prior was why you chose to blend it with Chardonnay.
I actually didn't choose to blend it necessarily with Chardonnay. The original concept was to blend it, was to make a singular wine with Massican, to make my Camus Conundrum, Calatal version of Conundrum, and because I thought that would be the most simplest thing as a kind of a new winemaker to Napa Sonoma, and someone who didn't have a lot of means and wherewithal to kind of get a project off the ground. I didn't want to make multiple wines, so I bought 5 grape varieties that first year: Ribolla, Tokaj, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Viognier. And I wanted to see how they all blended together, because I was inspired by the Friuli and Bianco wines, the Collio Bianco wines, that had everything from Tokaj and Sauvignon Blanc and Malvasia and Riesling and blended together. So that was really my inspiration, and it just never worked out that way. But Chardonnay is really there as kind of, a very floral and citrus part to kind of blend and glue the Tokaj and the Ribolla together.
So Megan, a question for you that came in was about the use of amphora. If you could explain why you use that and what you think it imparts to the wine.
When we started with the Vare Vineyard in 2008, we started with pungens. We didn't have amphora at that time, and we destemmed into the pungens, and we really love it. We love the extended maceration, and then our good pals at Arnot Roberts, thanks guys, passed us along some amphora, and we ferment the Ribolla as well as some Cab Franc in there. And what we find is it actually really elevates kind of the savory, piney qualities of Ribolla Gialla that we really love. But we were able to create a seal by putting wax around the amphora and then a slate top that we had made that's 120 pounds. And so we can effectively seal it with its skins and give that really long protected maceration on skin. So we're extracting everything, all the phenolics, all the flavors. And we just love, the texture, everything that extended time on skins brings. And it's really what we were drawn to with Ribolla. And it's fascinating, right? Because we can talk about red wines the same way. You can choose to make rosé, something like crisp, fresh. You're picking earlier, you're pressing, you're not fermenting on skins, or you can let it hang longer and then you're making a red wine. And I think between all of us, we are kind of working in this wide range of what Ribolla Gialla can be. And I think it's really fascinating to see that evolution here in California. And going back to, is this just a trend, or, now there's minute amounts. Steve probably knows exactly how many acreage, what the acres are now. I knew it used to be under 15. I don't know what's that. But I mean, this variety is very rare in California, and all of us are incredibly passionate about what we're doing. And really, on the scheme of things, we're talking about minute, tiny amounts being distributed and produced within California, and for that, the States.
Well, and actually you touched on a question that came in also, which I don't know, Miguel, maybe you can take this, which is how much actually comes from the Vare vineyard versus other places in California?
I think Steve probably knows better than me on the production of the Vare vineyard.
What do you have? You have about an acre or two at Grassi?
We have 1 acre, exactly.
Okay, and then I think Chris Bolin has 2 or 3 acres in Sonoma, if I'm not mistaken. And then you have about an acre, Ryme, at Megan with Ryme?
Yeah, we have an acre at Gittins.
Yep, and there's like a half acre on Mount Veeder. And then we have basically 3 acres. And then we have an acre at our own Matthiasson vineyard. And that's about it for California.
There's a little bit on Preacher Hill too, like a couple of rows, I think.
Okay.
And do all of the cuttings come from Vare Vineyard, or you don't?
No, there's 2 sources. So George Vare brought his in from Grosvenor, and that's a very funky virus variety. And then there's another one that came in through the normal channels, and so those are more vigorous. It's a more slightly, it grows pretty differently. That's what Chris has over in Sonoma, and those are the 2 that I'm aware of. And then the other one is back east at Channing Daughters in New York. And they have the one that came in from Italy through the normal channels.
Yeah, we got our budwood from Lee Hudson. He has a little bit too in Carneros.
Oh, and Lee does, yeah. And Lee got his in through the official channels. And so, yeah, so if you add it all together, it's 10 or 15 acres total, and probably in the whole country, including Long Island.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if you want to plant a vineyard, you might want to get cuttings from one of those newer vineyards. There's a lot of
like
virus.
when it just goes to 20 bricks and just stays for 2 months.
Yeah, there's a lot of virus in the Vare Bengier now vineyard. But I mean, This is only spoken from a winemaker standpoint, not a grower standpoint. To me, it's the perfect amount of virus because it just yields acid retention and some complexity and varied ripeness and all of the things that make a more intricate palate to work with. So
100%, Duncan.
Yeah.
Great. Fred, a good question that came in for you is about lees contact and whether the variety itself has sort of enough textural complexity, or if you use lees contact to enhance that.
With the lees contact, I leave things on there, the whites, the Ribolla and the Sauvignon Blanc on light lees. We don't do a lot of stirring, but I like to have the reductive protection underneath. On the other hand, when we talk about Ribolla and its kind of resistance to oxidation or even need for a little bit of oxygen, of the grape varieties I work with for whites, is probably the one that has the least need for it. I don't do any stirring or add any textural richness or anything like that. I just leave it on the lees, settled at the bottom of the amphora. And I think that the shape of the amphora also has a kind of a different sort of effect as far as lees contact goes versus a more traditional barrel arrangement. So that sort of surface area contact is something to consider as well, being that I feel that in the amphora, there's not the need to stir and also not the need to rack too regularly either. Just kind of leave things alone. It's my strategy.
Is that similar to how the rest of you?
With our amphora, we seal it up and we walk away from it. We don't even look at it for 6 months. So leave it completely alone. And we think by kind of leaving it alone and not interfering with it, it keeps that reductive state. And it's amazing to me every time we open it up, the skins are still really fresh and golden. They're not brown. Everything's perfectly preserved.
And actually, that was a question for skin contact. So in terms of cap management, you're just leaving it. You're not touching it at all.
During the primary fermentation, we leave it open, and so we are punching it down by hand in the amphora. So just plunging our arms down and mixing up. And then once the primary fermentation is towards the end, that's when we seal it up.
So another question that came in was, is that you know of outside of the North Coast? Are there plantings in other places like Oregon, Washington, the Finger Lakes?
I mentioned Channing Daughters in the South Fork on Long Island, and John Paul, who has Cameron Winery up in Oregon, a real, one of my favorite American Chardonnay and Pinot. He got some cuttings from us a few years back and planted a little bit of Ribolla up in the Willamette Valley. And that's the only Ribolla I'm aware of outside of California.
That's great news. I'm really happy to hear that John Paul has that. He couldn't be in better hands. That's the best news I've heard today, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question was about fermentation temperature. So I guess it sounds like there's a lot of sort of hands off, but does it generally do better at cooler fermentations? I know, Dan, would you want to take this one?
Yeah, I ferment, whole cluster press and independently ferment my Ribolla and blend it back later. Everything is done in barrels or done in larger 300-liter barrels, wood, neutral, and they're stored in a room that's about 60 degrees Fahrenheit ambient. So temperatures will typically go up to the 70 range. I like to try to keep them cooler than that, but it's really just what is available to me at that time. What I do find is that with warm, hot temperatures, because we do have this issue with that virus, especially in the original Vare planting, is that when you have the higher pH and you have higher fermentation temperatures, you risk going through malactic fermentation. So I do want to preserve as much of the freshness in this wine grape as possible. So I try to keep the fermentation temperatures as low as possible. But 68 to 70 Fahrenheit typically work really well. But also just, yes, Oregon, up in Bend, outside of Bend, Hood, Oregon, there's a white salmon bakery. And the gentleman who owns and operates that bakery is Jasko Grabner's nephew. And he's working with, I think, core cellars up there. And they have some Tokai and Ribolla planted, and they're making their own and having some fun stuff up there. They have a really great pizza oven and beautiful bakery. Just follow them on Instagram. It's like I get hungry every morning when I see their offerings. But yeah, so it's growing. It's definitely growing. We're expanding the universe of Ribolla Gialla, cool. West Coast.
Right on. So something that came in for all of you ahead of time was just what your favorite pairings are. So Duncan, do you want to start?
Favorite pairings. Oh man, I don't know. I think Ribolla goes really well with a. If I could just throw a dart at a board, it would be just like a really simple, slow cooked oven roasted chicken with like leeks and potatoes. It's something that I kind of go to for white wine in general. But I think that it has, if you cook it slow and you get all that lovely caramelization, and then some good onions, some good leeks, that would be pretty much really simple. Keep it really simple. A little bit of acid in there, but it's a question that I could go any direction with pairing, because I do feel like the wine is surprisingly versatile and you can drink it with a lot of different things. But that would probably be my go-to. Just a simple oven roast chicken stuffed with leeks and some potatoes. Call it.
Sounds delicious. Wow. Well, I know it's the middle of harvest, and you all have stayed awake for this entire hour, which is kind of amazing because I know you're all hustling pretty hard right now. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Last question is just, we talked about there's Ribolla Fest. Apparently, there's Albarino Fest. Like, what's the next thing that we're going to hear that there's a fest about?
Gamay Fest.
I would so be there. Yes. Anything else we should be on the lookout for?
I'm going Fiano and Alianico. Come on.
Yeah, Alianico Fest, Cab Franc Fest, Mondouse Fest, Pulsard Fest. Where do I stop? Trousseau Fest. Come on, don't get me started here.
And can we get Norello Mascalesi in there?
Yes, please.
Verdicchio. Come on.
Come on. I've heard there's a pretty decent Rafosco coming out of Napa.
Rafosco Fest. We need a few more people making Rafosco. Dang it. Yeah.
Yeah, that Rafosco is amazing, Steve. Keep making it. And maybe we can have a talk like this in a few years with more of us, because that's an amazing variety that's well suited for our climate, eh?
We just planted more of it.
All right, Steve, you just have to convince a few more friends and then we can have a fest.
Yeah.
So again, well, thank you all so much. This panel is absolutely amazing. It's such an honor to chat with you. And for participants at home, we'll follow up with a link to the wines on Wine Access if you would like to have a little tasting of your own at home. I have quite a nice evening ahead of me with these wines to enjoy, which are all delicious. So again, thanks everyone who watched at home. Thank you so much, panel, and have a wonderful, happy harvest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.